Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. Come with me on this journey and experience my tales of love, lies, betrayal, and revenge. Each story is from novels I've been writing for the past 5 years, and I've also been looking for creative, non-traditional ways to share my stories. After months of research, trial, and error, I decided to bring it here to YouTube. I hope you all enjoy.
Chapter 1. Anthony Abrams stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, the fluorescent light casting sharp shadows across his face. 4 days. That was all that remained until his 18th birthday. 4 days until he could finally execute the plan he had spent years crafting. The thought was his only lifeline in a house that had never felt like home. The air in the bathroom was thick with tension, though no one else was there. He had gotten used to the feeling. It had become his constant companion over the years. He traced a finger along his jaw, studying the tired, frustrated expression staring back at him. How many nights had he spent lying awake, waiting for the day he could finally walk away from all of this? He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Almost there. Downstairs, the clatter of plates and bursts of laughter filled the air. A manufactured warmth radiated from the dining room, but Anthony knew better. Tonight's pre-birthday dinner wasn't a celebration. It was just another opportunity for Thomas to subtly remind him of his place in the Edgewood hierarchy. No matter how many academic awards he won or how hard he worked, he would always be second to Ethan's athletic triumphs and Sophie's undeniable charm. Anthony smoothed down the collar of his neatly pressed shirt, inhaling sharply before heading downstairs. The moment he entered the dining room, the atmosphere shifted ever so slightly. Thomas, as usual, dominated the conversation, regaling Ethan with tales of his latest business deal. Ethan, ever the golden boy, listened attentively, laughing at all the right moments. Sophie sat beside Linda, doodling on a napkin, her bright eyes lighting up when she saw Anthony. "Anthony. So glad you could join us," Thomas said, his tone dripping with false warmth. "We were beginning to think you'd rather spend your evening with a textbook." Anthony forced a smile, sliding into his seat. "Just finishing up some homework, sir." Linda sent him a wary glance but said nothing. Her silence was as familiar as the weight in his chest. She had long ago chosen to keep the peace rather than stand up for him. It had taken years for Anthony to accept that. The dinner progressed predictably. Thomas steered the conversation toward Ethan's upcoming Stanford enrollment and his lacrosse achievements, lavishing praise while Linda nodded along. Anthony listened, his grip on his fork tightening, waiting for the inevitable dismissal of his own accomplishments. Sophie, ever his little defender, piped up cheerfully. "Anthony's robotics club won first place last month. And he's applying to MIT, right, Aunt?" Thomas barely acknowledged her. "That's nice, sweetheart." Then, as if on cue, he shifted the conversation. "Linda and I have been discussing a move," Thomas announced casually, taking a sip of wine. "A fantastic opportunity has come up in Los Angeles. It would be a significant step forward for the firm." Anthony's stomach dropped. Los Angeles? His mind raced. That would mean leaving everything behind. His teachers, his recommendations, his carefully planned future, and most importantly, Yolanda. "But I thought we were staying until after graduation," he said, struggling to keep his voice even. Thomas waved a dismissive hand. "Nothing is set in stone, but it's something we need to consider. You could always finish senior year online." "Online?" Anthony repeated, his voice rising. "I'm in advanced placement courses. My calculus teacher already sent my recommendation to MIT. "Anthony, don't be rude," Linda chided weakly. "Your father is just exploring options." Anthony scoffed. "He's exploring options that completely disregard my future." His eyes flicked to Linda, silently pleading for support, but she refused to meet his gaze. That hurt more than Thomas's indifference. And then something inside him snapped. "You've never cared about me, have you, Thomas?" His voice trembled, not with fear but with years of pent-up rage. "You've always treated me like I was some kind of inconvenience, an outsider in my own home. Ethan is your perfect son, Sophie is your little princess, and I'm just there." His breath was ragged, his heart pounding. "Well, I'm done. I'm done pretending that this is a family, done waiting for you to acknowledge me. In 4 days I turn 18. And when that happens, I'm leaving." A stunned silence fell over the table. Linda gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ethan looked down at his plate, pale and uncomfortable. Sophie's lower lip quivered, tears pooling in her wide eyes. But it was Thomas's reaction Anthony had been waiting for. The man's face darkened, his knuckles white against the table. But he didn't lash out. He didn't demand respect. He just stared, his mouth pressed into a thin line, as if truly realizing for the first time that Anthony was no longer a boy he could control. Anthony didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and walked away, his breath coming in uneven gasps as he climbed the stairs 2 at a time. He slammed his bedroom door behind him and leaned against it, feeling the adrenaline surge through his veins. He had done it. He had finally said everything he had bottled up for years. His gaze landed on the MIT brochure tucked beneath his laptop. Electrical engineering and computer science. His future. A future he would build on his own terms. He pulled out his laptop, determination hardening his resolve. He had college applications to finalize, scholarship essays to revise, and a new life to plan. Yolanda had already spoken to her family. Uncle William and Aunt Martha were more than willing to let him stay in their guest house until he got on his feet. He wasn't going to let anything stop him now. A soft knock at the door made him freeze. He hesitated before cracking it open, only to find Sophie standing there, clutching her stuffed bunny. Her cheeks were streaked with tears. "Anthony," she whispered, sniffling, "why did you yell at Daddy?" Anthony's heart clenched. He knelt to her level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sophie, I didn't mean to upset you," he said gently. "But sometimes grown-ups have to say things that are hard to say." Her lower lip wobbled. "Are you really leaving?" He nodded slowly. "I am." Sophie threw her arms around his neck, squeezing tight. "Will I still see you?" Anthony hugged her back just as fiercely. "Of course you will. We'll still play video games and I'll still read to you. I promise." She pulled away, wiping her eyes. "Okay." Her voice was small, uncertain, but she didn't fight him on it. She just gave him one last look before turning and padding back to her room. As he shut the door, a fresh wave of guilt threatened to swallow him whole. But he couldn't stay. Not for Sophie, not for anyone. He deserved more than this house, more than Thomas's indifference and Linda's silence. He deserved a real shot at happiness. And in 4 days he was taking it. Chapter 2. Anthony woke to the sound of soft rain tapping against his bedroom window. The weight of the previous night's argument still clung to him, but underneath it all was something else. A quiet sense of certainty. 3 days. That was all that stood between him and a future he could finally control. He glanced at the suitcase in the corner of his room. Today was the first step in that direction. He wasn't officially leaving yet, but he had made arrangements with William to move some of his belongings to the guest house. Less to carry on the final day. Less of a chance for Thomas to sabotage his escape. Pulling himself out of bed, Anthony showered and dressed quickly, opting for his usual jeans and a hoodie. As he tied his sneakers, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. "Yolanda, be there in 15. You ready?" "Anthony, yeah. Let's do this." He took one last look around his room, committing it to memory. Not because he would miss it, but because he needed to remember what he was leaving behind. The cramped space, the bare walls, the constant feeling of being unwelcome. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the next few days. The first move. By the time Anthony made it downstairs, the house was quiet. Linda was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee. She looked up when she saw him, her face lined with exhaustion. "Morning," she said softly. Anthony hesitated. "Morning." An awkward silence stretched between them. For a moment he considered telling her. Really telling her. That he was leaving. But the words stuck in his throat. He wasn't ready for another fight. He wasn't ready to hear another excuse for why she had never stood up for him. Instead, he grabbed an apple from the counter and muttered, "I'll be out for a while." Linda hesitated as if she wanted to say something, but she only nodded. "Okay." Anthony turned toward the door just as Sophie came bounding into the kitchen, her bunny clutched in one arm. "Are you going to school, Aunt?" "Not yet, Squirt," he said, ruffling her hair. "I have some errands to run first." Sophie tilted her head. "Can I come?" He crouched down and shook his head gently. "Not this time. But we'll do something fun soon, okay?" She pouted but nodded, her trust in him unwavering. "Promise." "Promise." Before Thomas or Ethan could make an appearance, Anthony grabbed his duffel bag and slipped out the door just as Yolanda's car pulled up to the curb. The sight of her instantly calmed the storm in his chest. She rolled down the window and smirked. "You look like you just escaped prison." "Not yet," he said, tossing his bag into the back seat. "But I'm working on it." A temporary goodbye. The drive to William's estate was quiet, the kind of quiet that spoke of anticipation rather than unease. Yolanda drove with one hand on the wheel, her other hand resting near Anthony's, close enough to touch. He appreciated the silent support. "You sure Thomas won't notice your stuff missing?" she finally asked. Anthony scoffed. "He barely notices when I'm missing. Pretty sure he won't care about a few bags." Yolanda frowned but didn't argue. She knew better than anyone how deep his stepfather's neglect ran. When they arrived at William's estate, the sight of the guesthouse made Anthony exhale in relief. The elegant structure sat nestled behind the main house, framed by lush greenery. It was a world away from what he was used to. Spacious. Inviting. A place where he could finally breathe. William was already waiting for them at the door. "Welcome home, Anthony," he said, his voice warm yet measured. Anthony shook his head with a small smile. "Not quite yet. I still have a few more days in the war zone." William nodded knowingly. "Understood. But your things will be safe here. Whenever you're ready, this door is open." They spent the next hour unloading Anthony's belongings. As he placed the last box in what would soon be his new bedroom, the reality of it all hit him. This wasn't just a temporary escape. This was his future. Yolanda watched him from the doorway. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I am." Back to the Edgewood house. By the time they returned to the Edgewood house, the sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the driveway. Anthony hesitated before stepping inside. The place felt even heavier now, like it was already part of his past. As expected, no one had noticed his absence. Thomas was locked away in his office, Ethan was at practice, and Linda was likely busy trying not to disturb the fragile peace between them all. He climbed the stairs and entered his now half-empty room. 3 more days. That was all that was left. His phone buzzed again. "Yolanda, did you make it in okay?" Anthony, "Yeah. No one even noticed I was gone." Yolanda, 3 more days. "We got this." He smiled at her unwavering faith. 3 more days and he would finally be free. Chapter 3. The aroma of burnt toast hung heavy in the air, a fitting metaphor for the atmosphere in the Edgewood kitchen. Anthony Abrams stared at the congealing eggs on his plate, his appetite vanished. Across from him, Thomas Edgewood, his stepfather, was holding court, regaling Ethan, his golden child son, with tales of high-powered finance deals. Thomas sat at the head of the table, his gaze sharp and disapproving as he scanned the morning paper. Ethan grinned at his phone. Mom fussed with Sophie's hair. "So, Anthony," Thomas began, his voice laced with a practiced indifference that always stung the most. "MIT, huh? Hope you're not expecting us to foot the entire bill. Ethan's needs come first, of course." Anthony swallowed, the oatmeal suddenly tasting like sawdust. "I already figured as much. That's why I applied for scholarships and financial aid. I'm also planning to work. Better safe than sorry." Thomas scoffed, folding his newspaper with unnecessary force. "Right. Work. Probably flipping burgers or something. Ethan's going to be interning at a prestigious law firm this summer. Real experience. You just coast through life, Anthony. Coasting on a 4.0 GPA, I suppose." The jab was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but it hit its mark. Anthony's hands were clenched under the table. He knew he shouldn't react, shouldn't give Thomas the satisfaction. The constant belittling would always chip away at him. But not anymore. With a slight smile, Anthony leaned forward. "Actually, Thomas, I've been offered an internship with Tech Innovations that starts a week after graduation. They are willing to let me continue working while I attend MIT. Anthony's phone chimed with a notification as if on cue. Looking at the message with excitement, he added, "By the way, Tech Innovations has just awarded me a full scholarship, room and board funding included." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Thomas's face hardened, his lips thinning into a disapproving line. Linda's head snapped up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. Even Sophie seemed to understand the significance of the moment, her eyes wide. Anthony continued. "Yeah, while you thought I was just coasting, I was making plans that none of you knew about nor even cared to ask." Ethan finally spoke. "I knew. I've been watching you all this time. I admire how hard you work in spite of Dad. Your determination inspired me to do better in academics and not rely on sports. My success is because of you, Anthony." Thomas's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing at Ethan, his expression dangerous. "What did you say?" Ethan met his father's gaze without flinching. "Yes, Dad. While you always looked down on Anthony and treated him like garbage, he was encouraging me, your golden boy, to be better." Ethan turned to Anthony. "I'm sorry for never speaking up for you until now. I was a coward, but I couldn't sit here any longer and listen to him belittle everything you've accomplished without the help of any of us, especially Mom. The air in the kitchen crackled with tension. For the first time, Ethan had stood up for him. It was a small act, maybe, but it felt monumental. Anthony felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. He had always believed that Ethan had his back, and not once did he ever doubt his brother's love. He pushed back his chair, the scrape of the legs against the linoleum echoing in the sudden quiet. "I'm done," he said, meeting Thomas's furious gaze. "I'm going to be late." He walked out of the kitchen, leaving behind the simmering resentment and the suffocating weight of Thomas's disapproval. Pulling out his phone, he texted Ethan. "Thanks, bro." Returning his phone to his pocket, Anthony began his walk to meet up with Yolanda. For the first time he felt lighter. He felt free. He headed toward the park, where he knew Yolanda would be waiting for him. He found her sitting on a bench, sketching in her notebook. As soon as she saw him, her face lit up. "Hey," she said, her voice warm. "How did it go?" He recounted the events of the morning. The scholarship, the internship, Ethan's unexpected defense, the familiar sting of Thomas's disapproval. Yolanda listened patiently, her expression shifting from anger to compassion. She took his hand, her touch grounding him. "That's amazing, Anthony. Who would have thought Ethan had a spine?" "Yeah," Anthony said, smiling. It was a pleasant surprise. That evening after dinner, Anthony found himself on the living room floor with Sophie, watching a cartoon movie. Linda eventually joined them, followed by Ethan. Despite the years of indifference from Thomas, it was moments like these that made it hard to leave. Watching his mother smile and hearing his little sister's laughter. When the credits rolled and everyone started to drift toward their rooms, Anthony retreated to his own space, a sanctuary filled with stacks of textbooks and memories boxed away. In his closet, he had been gradually packing his belongings, readying for his departure. As he rummaged through the old piles, a photograph slipped free and fluttered to the floor. Bending down, Anthony picked it up, his fingers grazing the faces of his mother and biological father, Lance, taken just months before he'd walked out of their lives and disappeared into the shadows of success. Lance's infectious smile was frozen in time, radiating warmth and love in stark contrast to Thomas's icy demeanor. He traced Lance's face with his fingertip, a wave of longing washing over him. Did he ever think about him? Did he know about Thomas's cruelty, the subtle digs, the constant undermining? Did he even care? William had told him stories about Lance. Before tech innovations blew up, his mother, Linda, was happily in love with Lance. But then Thomas came along and he saw Lance as someone who was standing in the way of his plans. He had manipulated the couple into breaking up, ensuring that Lance would leave Linda's life for good. William said he and Thomas were college schoolmates and that he was a good guy at one point. But things took a turn a few years later after his first wife's death, leaving him with a newborn child to raise. Thomas fell in love with Linda at first sight after a brief introduction at a coffee shop. His manipulative plans began the moment he realized she was in a relationship with Lance, but he hadn't anticipated her being pregnant. Thomas only found out after he had already driven a wedge in their relationship. A bitter laugh escaped Anthony's lips. Taking a deep breath, Anthony put the photo away. 2 more days, he whispered, reminding himself of the freedom on the horizon. He couldn't afford to dwell on the past. He had a future to build. A future where he would be more than just second best. Chapter 4. Anthony woke up with a feeling he had never experienced before. Calm. No weight on his chest, no sense of dread. Just a quiet certainty that today was the beginning of the rest of his life. Tomorrow he would be free. But today, on Valentine's Day, he planned to spend time with the people who mattered most. Sophie, Ethan, and Yolanda. He got dressed quickly, pulling on his hoodie before heading downstairs. The scent of chocolate and vanilla filled the kitchen, where Linda was carefully arranging heart-shaped chocolates in a crystal bowl. "They look nice, Mom," he said, offering a small smile. Linda glanced up, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. "Your father picked them out," she said softly. "He remembers how much you liked these when you were little." Anthony stiffened. "Thomas isn't my father." The words burned at the back of his throat, but he swallowed them. Instead, he just nodded and grabbed an apple from the counter. Sophie burst into the kitchen, clutching a handmade Valentine's Day card covered in glitter and stickers. "Anthony, I made you something." He knelt beside her as she thrust the card into his hands. On the front was a crayon drawing of the two of them, smiling, with hearts floating above their heads. Inside, in her slightly wobbly handwriting, she had written, "To the best big brother in the world. I love you so much. Happy Valentine's Day." Sophie, his throat tightened. He pulled her into a hug, squeezing tightly. This is the best Valentine's card I've ever gotten, squirt. She giggled. I made one for Ethan too, but yours has more glitter because you're special. Thanks, kiddo. Wanna hang out today? Just us. Sophie gasped excitedly. Yes. Can we go to the park? You got it. Morning with Sophie. After breakfast, Anthony and Sophie bundled up and headed to the neighborhood park. The crisp February air nipped at their faces, but Sophie didn't seem to care. She ran ahead, climbing the jungle gym before calling down, Aunt, help me across the monkey bars. Anthony chuckled. All right. He lifted her up so she could grab the bars, holding onto her waist as she swung across. When she reached the other side, she beamed. I did it. They played for over an hour, chasing each other, swinging on the swings, and building little towers out of leaves and twigs. For a little while, Anthony forgot about tomorrow. For a little while, he was just her big brother. Finally, as Sophie sat beside him on the bench, catching her breath, she looked up at him with big, curious eyes. Anthony, do you have a Valentine? He smirked. Maybe. Sophie gasped dramatically. It's Yolanda, isn't it? He laughed. You got me. Sophie leaned against his side. I like her. She makes you happy. She does, he admitted, smiling softly. Afternoon with Ethan. Back home, Anthony found Ethan in the living room flipping through channels. He plopped down next to him. Game? Ethan raised an eyebrow. You sure you want to lose today? Anthony smirked. Oh, I'm positive. They grabbed their controllers and loaded up NBA 2K, falling into an easy rhythm. For a while it was just like old times. Trash talking, shouting at the screen, laughing. Between matches, Ethan finally spoke. You ready for tomorrow? Anthony hesitated before nodding. Yeah, I think so. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know I don't say it much, but I'm proud of you, man. Anthony looked at him, surprised. Yeah. Ethan shrugged, keeping his eyes on the screen. You're doing what you have to do. And I get it. They played a few more rounds before Ethan nudged him. Are we still good after you leave? Anthony chuckled. Yeah, man. We're always good. Ethan grinned. Cool. Now let me kick your ass one more time. Evening with Yolanda. That evening, Anthony met Yolanda at their favorite spot. The overlook where the city lights stretched out like a sea of stars. She was already waiting, bundled in a thick coat, her breath visible in the cold air. She smiled as he approached. Happy Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day, he echoed, pulling her into his arms. They stood there for a moment, wrapped in each other's warmth. She pulled out a small gift bag and handed it to him. Open it. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, embossed with his initials. He ran his fingers over the cover. This is really nice. Yolanda smiled. You always write your thoughts down. Now you can start fresh in a place that actually makes you happy. Anthony reached into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Yolanda's eyes widened. Anthony. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with an infinity charm. I wanted you to have something to remind you that no matter where I go, we're in this together. She blinked rapidly, then grinned as she slipped it onto her wrist. I love it. Anthony exhaled, holding her hand. Tomorrow's going to be a lot. But when I leave that house, I want you to be the first person I see. I wouldn't be anywhere else, she promised. They stood there, the cold air forgotten, the world quiet except for the sound of their hearts beating in sync. Tomorrow everything would change. But tonight this moment was theirs. Chapter 5. Anthony woke on February 15th, the day of reckoning. 18 years. A milestone most celebrated with parties and gifts, but for him, it marked the beginning of his departure. A tight knot of anxiety and a strange flutter of excitement churned in his stomach. He was leaving the house that never felt like a home, the family that never quite felt like his. He lay in bed for a moment longer, listening to the familiar sounds of the house stirring to life. The clatter of Ethan rummaging in the kitchen, the soft murmur of his mother, and the booming voice of Thomas already barking orders. He knew what awaited him downstairs, a polite facade of a birthday breakfast, laced with the subtle yet ever-present indifference from Thomas. Anthony took his time getting ready. When he finally emerged and headed downstairs, he found the area eerily quiet. He looked around and saw that everyone was gone. Anthony went into the kitchen and found no note left. A hollow ache settled in his chest, but he refused to let it weigh him down. He took out his phone and dialed Yolanda's number. He slumped in a chair when she answered. Anthony? What's wrong? She asked. They left and didn't say goodbye. His voice cracked slightly. But I'm okay. I'm ready to leave now. I'll call my uncle and we'll be there within the hour, she assured him before hanging up. Anthony looked around the kitchen one last time before heading back to his room. The room he spent 17 years in was, as of today, no longer his. He sat at his desk and composed letters addressed to his mother, Ethan, and Sophie. After Anthony finished and sealed each letter in an envelope, he walked to each of their rooms and placed them where they could see them. When he made it to Sophie's room, he paused at a picture in a mermaid frame of them from her birthday party last year. "I'll miss you," he whispered to the photo, placing the letter in front of it. Yolanda and William arrived just as Anthony was coming out of Sophie's room. Yolanda called upstairs, "You ready, Anthony?" "I'm ready," he responded. Then they got to work, removing all his packed items from his room and loading them into the truck. After the last box was secured, Anthony took one last look around the living room. Locking the door, he placed his key under the flower pot and climbed into the car with Yolanda while William drove the truck. As they pulled from the curb, Anthony's phone chimed with a message from Ethan. "Ethan, I know you're moving your things today and I'm going to miss you. Happy birthday, bro, keep in touch." Anthony responded, "Thank you, bro. And I will. Kiss Sophie for me." He put his phone away in his pocket, and Yolanda reached for his hand. "Happy birthday, Anthony." He smiled, squeezing her hand. "Thank you, Yolanda." They arrived at the guest house 20 minutes later, and the sight continued to take Anthony's breath away. The opulent space was a far cry from his small bedroom at the Edgewood home. The guest house stood like a hidden jewel within William's sprawling estate, a sanctuary of quiet luxury designed for only the most discerning guests. Framed by manicured gardens and a stone pathway lined with flickering lanterns, its facade blended old-world charm with modern opulence. French limestone walls, arched windows, and an ornate wrought iron balcony overlooking a private courtyard. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of fresh-cut peonies and aged oak. A grand foyer, adorned with a crystal chandelier and a hand-woven Persian rug, led into the great room. Velvet-upholstered armchairs flanked a marble fireplace, and an oversized chandelier cast a warm glow over the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows, dressed in rich brocade drapes, opened onto a terrace with an infinity pool. Each of the 3 bedrooms was a sanctuary of indulgence. The master suite boasted a canopy bed draped in sheer silk, an antique vanity, and French doors that led to a secluded rose garden. In the corner, a small writing desk beckoned with its leather-bound journal and a silver fountain pen. Its ensuite bathroom featured a sunken marble tub beneath a skylight, where one could bathe beneath the stars. The second bedroom, equally lavish, had a clawfoot tub, a Juliet balcony, and a hand-carved 4-poster bed wrapped in Egyptian cotton. The third bedroom, though slightly smaller, was converted into a study. Soft lamplight filtered through ivory curtains, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floor. It exuded charm with its plush velvet chaise lounge and a private library wall filled with leather-bound books. A large mahogany desk sat in its center. The kitchen was designed for both function and grandeur. A chef's dream with a La Cornue range, custom oak cabinetry, and a marble island big enough for intimate gatherings. An adjoining dining space with an antique chandelier and a long mahogany table was set for candlelit feasts. Beyond the arched glass doors, a private terrace offered a heated plunge pool, a stone fireplace, and a set of chaise lounges where one could sip tea beneath the wisteria-draped pergola. The air was thick with jasmine and the soft rustle of the wind through cypress trees. Here time slowed. The world outside ceased to exist. In this haven of comfort and extravagance, Anthony could finally unwind and focus without Thomas's constant cruelty and indifference. After touring the house, Anthony, Yolanda, and William got to work moving his things into the master bedroom. He spent the rest of the morning unpacking, which was relatively easy. He hadn't had much to begin with. The small room he occupied at Thomas's house had made accumulating things nearly impossible. Yolanda came up to check on him, her expression curious as she looked around the room. "Wow, I never knew you had so little," she said. "I guess we'll have to change that." Anthony smiled. "Yeah, I guess we do." Time spent with Yolanda always made Anthony feel truly seen. Her presence was warm, steady, never rushing him, never dismissing the weight of his words. She listened with an openness that made it easy to let his guard down, to say things he hadn't spoken aloud in years. As the conversation stretched into the late afternoon, something shifted inside him. The burdens he had carried alone for so long felt just a little lighter. The past no longer seemed like a cage and the future didn't feel so daunting. Chapter 6. An enticing aroma wafted into the room where Anthony and Yolanda were chatting. They both paused, nostrils twitching. Their stomachs, fueled by ramen noodles and nervous energy, rumbled in protest. "Smells amazing," Yolanda said, a grin spreading across her face. "Uncle William must be cooking up a storm." Anthony laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in months. "Let's go investigate. I'm starving." They scrambled to their feet and raced down the stairs, anticipation buzzing in the air. But the laughter died in Anthony's throat as he stepped into the brightly lit living room. "Happy birthday," erupted from a chorus of voices. His breath hitched. Teachers, classmates, even some faces he vaguely recognized from Yolanda's family were all there, crammed into the spacious room. Streamers hung from the ceiling, the massive dining table displayed delicious-looking food, and the air crackled with an unexpected warmth. Martha, William's wife, had flown in all the way from London to meet him. He was momentarily paralyzed, overwhelmed by the sheer unexpectedness of it all. He had expected another year of being an afterthought, but here he was, the center of attention. He felt Yolanda's hands on his back guiding him through the crowd, a smile plastered on her face. As Anthony navigated the throng of well-wishers, a figure near the fireplace caught his eye. His heart lurched. Standing there, amidst the cheerful chaos, was a man who could have been his reflection, a slightly older, more polished version. He was tall, immaculately dressed in a tailored suit, and possessed the same sharp jawline and neatly styled dark hair. But it was the eyes that held Anthony captive, the same shade of piercing green that stared back at him every morning in the mirror. Their eyes locked, a silent connection sparking across the room. Time seemed to slow, the noise of the party fading into a distant hum. Anthony's legs felt strangely heavy as though rooted to the floor. The man smiled, a hesitant, hopeful curve of his lips. "Happy birthday, Anthony," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that sent a shiver down Anthony's spine. Anthony took small, tentative steps forward, his mind reeling. This couldn't be. It was impossible. He had only ever seen pictures, faded snapshots his mother had kept hidden away in the attic. But there was no mistaking it. The face, the eyes, the unmistakable resemblance. He stopped a few feet away, his own eyes darting over the man's face, searching for confirmation, for any clue that this was real. It was real. Finally, unable to contain the emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long, Anthony surged forward, wrapping his arms around the man in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down his face, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and a profound sense of homecoming. "I thought I'd never meet you, Dad," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. He felt the man's arms tighten around him, a comforting, solid presence. "I've waited 18 years for this moment," Lance replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm proud of you. So very proud of you." The world seemed to realign itself. The years of quiet resentment, the feeling of being an outsider, the gnawing questions that had haunted him for as long as he could remember, all seemed to coalesce into this single, overwhelming moment. He had a father. He wasn't alone. As they pulled apart, Anthony drank in his father's face, memorizing every line, every crease, every subtle nuance. "Why?" he asked, the word barely a whisper. "Why weren't you there?" Lance's smile faltered, a shadow of pain crossing his features. He took Anthony's hand, leading him away from the crowd, towards a quieter corner of the room. "It's a long story, son," Lance said, his gaze intense. "A story involving manipulation and lies. Thomas is a calculating man. Once his mind is set on something, he will stop at nothing to get what he wants." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He succeeded in separating me from your mother. But I never stopped watching over you, Anthony. Never." He explained how Thomas had orchestrated his departure, twisting words and planting seeds of doubt, preying on Lance's youthful insecurities to make him believe that leaving was the best thing for Linda and their unborn child. He told Anthony of the secret arrangements he had made over the years, the anonymous contributions to his education, the coded messages hidden within seemingly random gifts. Anthony listened in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process the information. The anger he had harbored towards his father for all these years began to dissipate, replaced by a new wave of understanding and a burning desire to know more. "William," Lance continued, gesturing towards Yolanda's uncle who was watching them with a knowing smile, "is more than just a friend, he is my business partner. I asked him to keep you grounded, and I hope you continue to do great things for yourself." Martha strolled over. "Okay, enough explanations, you can continue this conversation later. It's time for the birthday boy to make a wish and blow out the candles." Anthony walked over to a table where a beautiful 3-tier cake sat adorned with 18 candles. While everyone sang the birthday song, Anthony closed his eyes, took a deep breath and blew out the candles. The evening unfolded in a haze of emotions. Anthony was finally able to properly greet Martha, a fiery woman who exuded confidence and a no-nonsense attitude. William shared tales about how he and Martha met. Lance regaled him with stories of his childhood, of his ambitions, of the dreams he had held for their future. Anthony in turn shared his struggles, his triumphs, his hopes for college and beyond. Later, as the party wound down and the last guest departed, Anthony stood with Lance on the porch of the guest house, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the warmth of the evening. "I know I can't make up for lost time, Anthony," Lance said, his voice low and sincere. "But I promise you I'll be there for you from now on. Whatever you need, whatever you want to do, I'll be right beside you." Anthony nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. The anger and resentment of the past were receding, replaced by a sense of hope and possibility. He finally felt free from Thomas's house to start his own life as he had envisioned. He now had a partner in his biological father, William, Yolanda, and now Martha. His escape and departure, once planned in solitude and bitterness, had taken an unexpected turn. He had found not just freedom but family. And for the first time in his life, Anthony felt like he was truly home. Chapter 7. Anthony woke with a smile stretching across his face, the kind that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. Sunlight streamed through the window of the guest house, painting the room in a golden hue. The previous day felt like a dream. The quiet move, the unexpected birthday celebration, and the earth-shattering revelation of his biological father. He stretched, feeling muscles he hadn't realized were tense finally relax. This was it. A new beginning. A chance to finally breathe, to finally be more than just second best. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and padded toward the dresser. A folded piece of paper and a set of keys lay there, catching the light. His heart skipped a beat. He picked up the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. It was a letter, handwritten in a strong, confident script. "My dearest Anthony, I know this must be overwhelming, but I couldn't let you start this new chapter without knowing how much I've always cared. Before you were even born, I started planning for your future, hoping that one day I could be a part of it. I know it's not a substitute for being there, for raising you, but please know it comes from a place of deep love and regret. Enclosed are the details of an account I established for you. It's yours to use as you see fit, for your dreams or whatever your heart desires. These funds are separate from what I have set aside for your education. Also, you may find the keys will unlock new possibilities and open doors to take you where you want to be. Know that I am always here, no longer watching from afar, ready to help in any way I can. I only ask that you live your life to the fullest and never doubt your worth. With all my love, Lance." His breath caught in his throat. He unfolded the attached document. It detailed a trust account. The Anthony Abrams Future Fund. Established 18 years ago. His eyes widened in disbelief. The balance? $5 million. $5 million. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter and document fluttering to the floor. $5 million. It was an unimaginable sum, enough to erase years of feeling inadequate, of pinching pennies, of knowing he'd have to work twice as hard as Ethan just to get half the recognition. He picked up the keys. Attached to it was a small, elegant tag with the logo of a Porsche 911 Carrera. This was more than just money, it was a symbol. A symbol of his father's enduring love, of his belief in him. He sat there for a long moment, stunned. He finally understood the depth of what Lance had prepared for him. He understood the guilt that must have haunted him all these years. He felt a surge of complicated emotions. Gratitude, disbelief, anger at the stolen years, and a fierce determination to make his father proud. He knew what he had to do. He had to prove to Lance that he was worthy of this gift, that he wouldn't squander it. He would excel in his studies, plan carefully for college, and build a life that was not only successful but also meaningful. After a quick shower, Anthony dressed in his usual jeans and t-shirt but felt like a different person. He was no longer the boy who was constantly overshadowed. He was Anthony Abrams, a young man with a future brimming with possibilities. In the kitchen, William was sipping coffee while a cook flipped pancakes. The aroma of maple syrup filled the air. "Morning, Anthony. Slept well?" William asked, a warm smile on his face. "Like a rock," Anthony replied, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. "This smell amazing. Meet Amanda. She's been hired along with a few extra people to help around this place while you focus on your studies," William said. "I could cook and clean for myself." I just appreciate all you're doing for me. No. Your father insisted on hiring them. So just accept it. William's stance was firm. You're the son of a billionaire, therefore you have to adjust to how your life is changing. Okay. Anthony hesitated before nodding. Okay. Now finish breakfast. The rest of the staff will be here to clean up within the hour. Anthony ate breakfast with William, making small talk about school and his project in the robotics club. He couldn't stop the smile from playing on his lips. He felt lighter than he had in years. Yolanda arrived a little later, her eyes sparkling with excitement. Ready for a day out? She asked, grabbing his hand. He nodded, a grin spreading across his face. More than ready. Anthony led Yolanda to the brand new Porsche his father had gifted him, and they drove into the city, the windows down, the music blasting. They laughed and sang along to their favorite songs, the worries of the past fading with each mile. Their first stop was the bookstore. Anthony had always loved reading but had rarely been able to afford new books. Today he could buy anything he wanted. He browsed the shelves, carefully selecting a stack of novels, biographies, and textbooks that had always been just out of reach. Next they went to a clothing store. Anthony's wardrobe consisted mostly of hand-me-downs from Ethan. Now he could finally buy clothes that fit him, clothes that made him feel confident. Yolanda helped him choose a completely new wardrobe. Jeans, t-shirts, stylish jackets, and sneakers. He was fitted for bespoke suits to match his new status with shoes to complement. Later that afternoon, after lunch at an upscale restaurant, they parked by the ocean. He took a deep breath and turned to Yolanda, his heart pounding. I have something to tell you, he began, his voice a little shaky. He told her everything. About the letter, the account, the car. When he finished, she was silent for a moment, then she threw her arms around him, squeezing him tight. Anthony, that's amazing, she exclaimed, her voice filled with joy. You deserve all of this and more. He pulled back and looked at her, his eyes shining with gratitude. I know this changes things, he said, but it doesn't change how I feel about you. You're the most important person in my life and I want to share all of this with you. She smiled, her eyes filled with love. I know, she said. And I feel the same way. This just means we have even more opportunities to build our future together. Chapter 8. Anthony had settled into the guest house with an ease he never thought possible. For the first time in his life, he woke up without the weight of his stepfather's disdain pressing down on him. His days had taken on a rhythm. Early mornings spent studying, afternoons exploring the estate and its hidden corners, and evenings with Yolanda, their bond growing stronger with every whispered conversation and shared dream. And then there was Lance. At first, their interactions had been cautious, measured. But over time, Anthony found himself drawn to the man who had once been nothing more than a distant name. Their conversations stretched late into the night. Discussions about business, philosophy, life. He had never realized how much he wanted a father's presence until he had one. Still, something was missing. Ethan and Sophie. No matter how much peace he had found, there was an ache in his chest whenever he thought about his siblings. Sophie's bright, innocent laughter. Ethan's quiet companionship. He missed them in a way he couldn't ignore. So he extended the invitation, half expecting Thomas to refuse. But to his surprise, Ethan and Sophie showed up one Saturday afternoon, their faces lighting up the moment they saw him. Sophie launched herself into his arms, her tiny frame shaking with excitement. I missed you so much, Aunt. Ethan stood back, hands in his pockets, a smirk tugging at his lips. You look good, man. This place suits you. Anthony grinned as he led Ethan and Sophie through the guest house, their expressions shifting between awe and excitement. This place is huge, Sophie exclaimed, her wide eyes darting around the grand foyer. It's even bigger than our house. Anthony chuckled. It's not that big, sophomore. Ethan smirked. It kind of is, though. Anthony rolled his eyes but kept walking, guiding them through the elegant living room with its high ceilings, plush furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. Sophie ran her fingers along the soft velvet of the couch before hopping onto it, giggling as she sank into the cushions. You have the best couch ever, she declared. Ethan gave a low whistle as he eyed the fireplace and the intricate artwork lining the walls. William really hooked you up. Anthony shrugged. Yeah, it's nice. But the best part is just having my own space. He led them through the dining area and into the kitchen, where stainless steel appliances gleamed under the soft lighting. And this, Anthony said with a grin, is where I pretend I know how to cook. Ethan laughed. I'll believe it when I see it. Sophie gasped, grabbing Anthony's sleeve. Wait, where's your room? Smirking, Anthony led them upstairs. He pushed open the door to his bedroom, revealing a space that was both stylish and personal. Sleek yet cozy, with books stacked neatly on the desk, a few framed photos of him and Yolanda on the nightstand, and a massive bed draped in soft, dark-colored sheets. Sophie ran straight to the bed and flopped onto it, giggling as she bounced. "This is so much better than your old room. Can I sleep here too?" Anthony chuckled. "Maybe next time, kiddo." Ethan nodded approvingly, taking in the room. "This really is a fresh start for you." Anthony met his brother's gaze and for the first time, saw something other than pity. He saw pride. And that meant everything. As the scent of roasted garlic and herbs filled the air, Amanda set the last dish on the elegantly set dining table. A spread of grilled steak, buttered asparagus, creamy mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread. Sophie's eyes went wide with excitement. "This is so much better than what we eat at home," she whispered loudly, making Ethan chuckle. Anthony smiled as Amanda gave them a knowing wink before retreating back to the kitchen. Once they started eating, he took a deep breath and decided to ask the question that had been lingering in his mind. "So, how are things at home? How's Mom?" Ethan sighed, setting down his fork. "She's different, quieter. I think she misses you, but she won't admit it. She avoids talking about you around Dad." Sophie frowned, poking at her mashed potatoes with her fork. "Daddy doesn't like when we say your name." Her little voice was barely above a whisper. "He gets all grumpy and says you made your choice." Anthony clenched his jaw, anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. It wasn't surprising that Thomas was acting like that, but hearing it from Sophie made it hurt even more. "What about you guys?" he asked. "Has he been treating you any differently?" Ethan hesitated before shaking his head. "Not really. He's just colder. More on edge. I think he's mad that you're actually doing okay without him." Anthony scoffed. "Figures." Sophie, oblivious to the tension between her brothers, happily took another bite of her food. "I don't care what Daddy says," she said matter-of-factly. "I'm always going to love you, Aunt." Anthony's heart clenched and he reached across the table to squeeze her tiny hand. "I love you too, sophomore." Ethan gave him a small, understanding nod. "We both do." In that moment, Anthony knew that no matter what Thomas tried to do, no matter how much distance was between them, his bond with his siblings would never break. Anthony leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "I wish you guys had been at my birthday party. It was a lot. Yolanda and William threw this big surprise for me and, well, I met my father." Ethan nearly dropped his fork. "Wait, what?" Sophie's eyes widened. "Your real daddy?" Anthony nodded. "Yeah. His name is Lance Albright. Turns out he's been keeping an eye on me for years, but Thomas made sure he stayed out of my life. He thought my mom had moved on." Ethan frowned. "And you believe him?" Anthony hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. He showed me proof. Letters he wrote to Mom that she never got. Bank statements where he sent money, but Thomas intercepted it. And then there's William. He's been working with Lance this whole time." Sophie clapped her hands together. "So, you have two daddies now?" Anthony chuckled. "Something like that." Ethan shook his head. "Man, that's insane. And what did he give you?" Anthony sighed. "He set up a trust fund for me. He's giving me access to his network and he wants to teach me everything he knows. He also gave me the one thing I never thought I'd have. A real father." The weight of his words settled between them as Sophie beamed. "I want to meet him." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, me too." After dinner, the three of them curled up on the oversized sectional in the living room, a soft throw blanket draped over Sophie as she nestled between her brothers. They chose an animated movie. One of Sophie's favorites. Letting the warmth of the moment settle in. Laughter filled the room as Sophie giggled at the funny scenes, while Ethan and Anthony exchanged quiet smiles, enjoying the rare peace between them. By the time the credits rolled, Sophie was barely keeping her eyes open, her small head resting against Anthony's shoulder. "I think someone's ready for bed," Anthony murmured, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Ethan stretched and yawned. "Yeah, we should head out before she knocks out completely." As they left, Anthony knew one thing for sure. He would always have a place in their lives no matter what. Chapter 9. Anthony stood on the manicured lawn of the Edgewood house, the familiar scent of pine and freshly cut grass doing little to soothe the churning in his stomach. He clutched Yolanda's hand, her presence his anchor in the storm of emotions brewing inside him. Determination warred with a lifetime of ingrained anxiety. Today he would finally confront Thomas. Yolanda squeezed his hand. "You got this, Anthony. You deserve answers." He nodded, took a deep breath, and walked toward the imposing front door. Sophie answered, her bright eyes widening in surprise and then softening with a warmth he rarely saw from his family. "Anthony," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. "What are you doing here?" "Hey, Squirt," he said, ruffling her hair. "I need to talk to Thomas." "And Mom?" Sophie's smile faltered. "He's in his study. But he's not in a good mood." Anthony forced a smile. "Thanks, sophomore. I appreciate the warning." He turned to Yolanda. "Wait for me in the living room?" Yolanda nodded, her eyes filled with unwavering support. He watched her walk away, then steeled himself and headed toward the lion's den, confronting Thomas. Thomas was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, the afternoon sun glinting off his silver hair. He looked up, his expression a cold mask of indifference. "Anthony," he acknowledged curtly. "What do you want?" "I think after 18 years I deserve more than that," Anthony said, his voice surprisingly steady. He pulled up a chair, ignoring the slight flinch on Thomas's face. "I want to know why you've always treated me like I'm invisible. Like I don't belong here." Thomas scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous. I provided for you, didn't I? Put a roof over your head, food on the table." "That's not what I'm talking about," Anthony said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm talking about the emotional neglect. The constant feeling that I'm not good enough." "Why, Thomas? Why the animosity?" Thomas leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed. "You really want to know? Fine. You're a constant reminder of Linda's past. You're not my blood. Ethan is my son, Sophie is my daughter. You're different." The words hit Anthony like a physical blow. He had always suspected it, but hearing it spoken aloud, so casually, was devastating. "So, that's it? Because I'm not your real son? Is that why you've always made sure I knew my place? Second best." "You've always been second best," Thomas sneered. "Ethan will go to Stanford. He'll be a lawyer, a success. What will you be, Anthony? Another disappointment?" Rage surged through Anthony, but he fought to control it. He had come here for answers, not a shouting match. "I've worked hard for everything I've achieved. I'm an honors student. I'm going to MIT. I've earned my place regardless of what you think." He stood up, his gaze unwavering. "And Mom?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why does she let you treat me this way? Why doesn't she ever stand up for me?" Before Thomas could reply, Linda walked into the study, her face pale and drawn. She had clearly heard their conversation. "Anthony, please," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't do this." He looked at her, his heart breaking. "Mom, why?" She avoided his gaze. "Thomas. He provides for us. I can't. I couldn't risk upsetting him." Disappointment washed over Anthony, a bitter wave that threatened to drown him. He had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that his mother would finally defend him. But she was as trapped in this toxic dynamic as he had been. Suddenly, the front door burst open and Lance strode into the room. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and radiated an aura of power that silenced everyone. "Lance versus Thomas." "Thomas," Lance said, his voice dangerously low. "We need to talk." Thomas paled visibly. "Lance? What are you doing here?" Lance ignored him, his eyes fixed on Anthony. "Son," he said, his voice softening, "I think it's finally time you knew the truth." Anthony stared at him, confusion warring with a flicker of hope. "What truth?" Lance turned his gaze back to Thomas, his expression hardening. "Tell him, Thomas. Tell him how you manipulated me, how you drove me away from Linda before I even knew she was pregnant." Thomas sputtered, "That's a lie. You left her. You abandoned her." "Still want to continue that narrative?" Lance asked, his voice calm but firm. "You intercepted all of my letters, spread rumors, made sure I believed Linda had moved on. You wanted her for yourself, and you were willing to do anything to get her." The room was silent, the air thick with unspoken accusations and buried secrets. Anthony looked from Lance to Thomas, his mind reeling. Could it be true? "And why are you here now?" Thomas challenged, regaining some composure. "After all these years? Why suddenly care about Anthony?" "I've always cared about him," Lance said, his eyes never leaving Anthony's. "I may not have been physically present, but I've been watching over him, ensuring he had the best opportunities. William has been keeping me informed." The pieces clicked into place. William's generosity, the unwavering support, it all made sense now. Lance had always been in the picture, silently waiting for a chance to right the wrongs that plagued him. "I've been funding his education, providing for his future, all from afar," Lance continued. I wanted to protect him from your toxicity, Thomas, to ensure he had a chance to succeed despite your indifference. Anthony looked at Lance, tears welling in his eyes. He had always felt so alone, so unwanted. But now, standing here, facing this revelation, he finally felt a sense of belonging, a sense of worth. Introductions that mattered. Before the silence stretched too long, Ethan and Sophie appeared in the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Sophie's eyes went wide as she looked up at Lance. "You're Anthony's real daddy?" Lance smiled warmly and crouched to her level. "Yes, I am. And you must be Sophie." Sophie grinned. "You look like him." Ethan stepped forward, scrutinizing Lance carefully. "So, you've been watching out for him this whole time?" Lance met Ethan's gaze, unwavering. "I have. And I want to do the same for you both if you'll let me." Ethan hesitated before nodding. "Guess we have a lot to talk about." Anthony took a deep breath and turned back to Thomas. "You've controlled my life long enough. I don't need your validation anymore." Thomas looked at him with cold eyes, but Anthony no longer cared. He had a real family now. One that chose him. He walked to Yolanda, who had come to stand near the doorway, her eyes shining with pride. He took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "I'm ready," he said, his voice filled with newfound confidence. "I'm ready to leave this behind and start my own future." Lance placed a hand on Anthony's shoulder. "Then let's go." As they walked out, Anthony knew one thing for certain. He had broken free. Chapter 10. The fallout from the confrontation rippled through Thomas's life like a storm he never saw coming. His carefully curated image as a respectable businessman and family man crumbled when word spread through his company about the way he had treated Anthony. Whispers turned into open disapproval, and suddenly Thomas found himself isolated. The board of directors, unwilling to associate with someone whose personal failures tainted their reputation, swiftly denied him the promotion he had been vying for. The blow wasn't public, but it was equally humiliating, leaving Thomas with nothing to show for the years he had spent trying to control a narrative that no longer belonged to him. He had built a life on appearances, and the ugly truth had finally been exposed. Although he wasn't fired nor demoted, he knew it would take time to start over and rebuild. But this time he would do it without pretense. And first he needed to right the wrong he had created with Anthony. It was 18 years in the making. He started small, sending Anthony an email, then a text. He offered no excuses, only a simple apology and a willingness to listen. Anthony, wary but not entirely closed off, agreed to meet. The conversation was difficult, awkward, but it was a start. Thomas acknowledged his mistakes, his prejudice, and his inability to see Anthony for who he truly was. He didn't expect forgiveness, but he hoped for understanding. Linda's awakening. Linda was forced to reckon with the truth she had long since ignored. Without Anthony in the house, the silence became suffocating. The constant tension that had permeated the atmosphere was gone, replaced by an emptiness that echoed her failures as a mother. Sophie's innocent questions about why her big brother had to leave and Ethan's quiet resentment toward their father only deepened her guilt. For years, she had allowed herself to believe that keeping the peace was an act of love, that smoothing things over was better than confronting the blatant injustice. But now, with the damage laid bare, she saw her silence for what it truly was. Complicity. She had stood by and watched as Thomas chipped away at Anthony's spirit, and the realization was a crushing weight. How would she ever make things right with Anthony? Would he even allow her to try? These questions turned her deeper into regret, a regret that gnawed at her each day. Determined to change, Linda sought therapy, confronting her own passivity and learning to assert herself. She started spending more time with Anthony, listening to his dreams and offering genuine support. She admitted her failings and asked for his forgiveness. It was a slow process, but she was committed to proving that she could be the mother he had always needed. Lance's presence. Meanwhile, Lance refused to waste another moment. Manipulated by Thomas's lies, he had been robbed of Anthony's childhood, and he was determined to make up for lost time. Though their bond was still new, Lance made every effort to be present, guiding Anthony not just as a father but as a mentor. He attended Anthony's robotics club meetings, offering insights drawn from his own experiences in the tech world. Whether it was late-night conversations about the past or long discussions about Anthony's future, there was an unspoken promise between them. Lance was here to stay. One evening, as Anthony sat in the guest house, working on a particularly challenging coding problem, Lance walked in. He carried a worn leather briefcase, which he set down on the table with a quiet thud. "I wanted to show you something," Lance said, his voice tinged with emotion. He opened the briefcase and pulled out a faded photograph. It was a picture of him and Linda, young and full of dreams, taken just before everything fell apart. "This was us," Lance said softly. "Before Thomas came along." Anthony stared at the photograph, a wave of emotions washing over him. He saw the hope in his father's eyes, the love that had been stolen from him. "I messed up, Anthony," Lance continued. "I let him manipulate me. But I promise you, I'm not going to let him hurt you anymore." Anthony looked up at his father, his heart filled with a mix of gratitude and understanding. He knew that the past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten. "I know," Anthony said, a small smile playing on his lips. "And I'm not going to let him either." Strengthening bonds. Despite his departure from the Edgewood house, Anthony refused to sever ties with Ethan and Sophie. He understood that they too were victims of Thomas's behavior, trapped in a toxic environment. He made it a priority to spend time with them, creating a new kind of family dynamic separate from the weight of their father's cruelty. Weekends became their time. Movie marathons fueled by pizza and laughter, trips to amusement parks where they could scream without consequence, and late-night talks where they shared their hopes and fears. These moments reminded them all that, in spite of the circumstances, their sibling bond remained unbreakable. Ethan, in particular, started to see things differently. Without Anthony around, he had become more aware of the way their father treated people, how his words carried a poison Ethan had long ignored. Slowly he began to pull away, questioning the lessons he had absorbed over the years. He admired Anthony's resilience, his refusal to conform to the expectations Thomas had forced upon them. Sophie, too young to fully understand the complexities, simply loved her big brother. As long as she could see him, as long as he still played games with her and read to her at night, she was happy. A future taking shape. Anthony focused on his studies, driven by a newfound sense of purpose. He dove deep into the world of electrical engineering and computer science, finding a passion that consumed him. He spent hours tinkering with circuits and writing code, losing himself in the intricate logic of it all. His enrollment at MIT and his internship was just around the corner, the excitement building day by day. He wanted to succeed not just for himself but for everyone who believed in him. William and Martha played a significant role in Anthony's transition. William continued to subtly guide Anthony, offering advice, while Martha, with her sharp intellect and unwavering support, became a confidant, someone Anthony could trust. Their presence was a constant source of encouragement. They were people who genuinely cared about his well-being. Yolanda remained Anthony's pillar of support, their love deepening as they moved forward together. One weekend, she took him to visit her parents' grave, an intimate and emotional moment that strengthened their bond. As they stood in front of the headstones, she shared stories of the love and values they had instilled in her, and Anthony, for the first time, felt what it meant to truly belong to someone's heart without condition. His story to tell. His past no longer defined him, but he wasn't going to run away from it either. He was determined to move forward. Towards a future shaped by love, ambition, and the people who truly mattered. He was building a new family, new alliances. A bond based on honesty, support, and a belief in one another. He was Anthony Abrams, and he was finally in control of his own story. Chapter 11. Anthony sat in the dimly lit therapy room, his hands clasped together as he listened to the steady ticking of the clock. The air was thick with unspoken words, decades of pain condensed into a single space. Across from him sat Thomas and Linda, both looking as uneasy as he felt. The therapist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a soothing presence, observed them patiently, waiting for someone to break the silence. Anthony exhaled sharply, deciding to speak first. "I don't even know where to begin," he admitted. His voice wasn't angry, just tired. "For as long as I can remember, I've been treated like I didn't belong in my own home." He looked at Thomas, meeting his stepfather's gaze head-on. "And you made sure I felt that way." Thomas shifted uncomfortably. His usual authoritative presence was muted here, where there was no room for dominance. Only truth. He hesitated, then sighed. "I was unfair to you, Anthony. I know that now." Anthony narrowed his eyes. "Now?" His words carried the weight of 18 years of neglect. "What changed, Thomas? Why are you here?" Thomas's jaw tightened before he spoke. "Because I lost control of what I thought I had under control. I believed I was protecting my family, but the truth is, I was just avoiding my own failures." He took a breath. "I lost my first wife. I was angry at the world, and when Linda married me, I saw you as a reminder of what I didn't have. I convinced myself that I had to be harder on you because you weren't mine. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth." Anthony's throat tightened. He had spent years trying to understand why Thomas resented him, and now hearing it, he wasn't sure if it made things better or worse. "So, I was just collateral damage?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Thomas shook his head. "No. You were a kid who deserved better and I failed you." His voice wavered, something Anthony had never heard before. "I can't take back the years I wasted. I can't undo what I did to you. But I want to change that now if you'll let me." Anthony wanted to scoff, to tell him it was too late. But before he could, Linda spoke. "And I let it happen," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Tears gathered in her eyes as she turned to Anthony. "I should have fought for you. I should have stood up to him." She swallowed hard. "But I told myself that keeping the peace was what was best for everyone. That if I just held on long enough, things would get better. But they didn't. And I was too much of a coward to stop it." Anthony's emotions swirled. A mix of anger, sadness, and something else. Maybe exhaustion. He had waited so long to hear these words, but now that they were here, they felt hollow. Words didn't erase years of neglect. Apologies didn't fix broken childhoods. The therapist finally spoke. "Healing isn't instant, Anthony. And forgiveness isn't something that can be forced. It's a process." She glanced between them. "The question is, do you want to take the first step?" Anthony inhaled slowly, looking between the people who had shaped his pain. He didn't have an answer yet. But maybe, just maybe, he was willing to try. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling slowly. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easily. Not after years of pain, neglect, and resentment. But as he sat in that room, watching the raw vulnerability in Thomas's expression and the guilt in Linda's eyes, he realized something. They were trying. Truly trying. And for the first time he saw them not just as his tormentors, but as flawed people who had let their own fears and weaknesses dictate their actions. "I don't know how to just let go of everything," Anthony admitted, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "I can't pretend that things didn't happen. But..." He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I think I want to try." Linda let out a quiet sob, covering her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. Thomas's shoulders sagged with relief, but he didn't move, didn't reach out. He seemed to understand that forgiveness wasn't the same as absolution. It was just a beginning. The therapist nodded, her expression warm but measured. "That's all anyone can ask for, Anthony. Healing isn't linear. There will be setbacks, difficult conversations, and moments where resentment resurfaces. But if you're willing to take that step, it means progress." Thomas cleared his throat, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you," he said simply, the words carrying a depth Anthony hadn't heard before. Linda wiped her tears, looking at Anthony like she was seeing him for the first time. "I'll do whatever it takes to earn your trust again." "I mean that." Anthony nodded, unsure of what the future held. He wasn't naive enough to think everything would magically be okay. There would be days when the anger and hurt threatened to consume him again. But for now, for the first time, he felt like he had control over his own healing. Maybe, just maybe, there was light at the end of this tunnel after all. Back at the guest house, Anthony let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The guest house used to feel like an escape. A place to run to shut everyone out. But now, it felt more like a boundary, a space that was his where he could choose how and when to let them in. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. He turned, seeing Ethan standing there with his usual nervous energy. "Hey," Ethan said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Movie night." Anthony studied his brother for a moment. There was no tension in his voice, no hesitation. Just an invitation. A simple moment of connection. A slow smile tugged at Anthony's lips. "Yeah, let's do it." As they settled into their seats, trading jabs over which movie to watch, Ethan cleared his throat. "So, how did it go at therapy?" "It was tough," Anthony sighed. "But I think they're trying. I feel that they're trying to do better, but it's going to take time. Years of pent-up resentment don't erase overnight. If they're willing to make amends, I'm willing to let them try." "That sounds like a first step to me," Ethan replied. Leaning back on the couch, Anthony realized something. Healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing to move forward anyway. And for the first time, he wasn't walking that path alone. In the coming weeks, therapy sessions continued. Some were productive, others were tense, but little by little, Anthony saw progress. Thomas remained guarded, but he made efforts. Small things like asking about Anthony's projects, acknowledging his achievements. Linda was more direct, texting Anthony daily, making sure he knew she was present. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. And Anthony, for the first time in his life, felt like he had a choice in how this story unfolded. Chapter 12. Months of therapy had chipped away at the years of pain, resentment and silence that once defined Anthony's relationship with his mother and Thomas. Things between them weren't perfect and he doubted they ever would be. But perfection wasn't the goal. Understanding was. Now, when they sat together, the thick, suffocating tension that once loomed over their conversations had lessened. No more nervous glances, no more waiting for the other shoe to drop. Conversations felt more natural, less like an obligation and more like an effort they were all willing to make. Linda looked different. Lighter. She stood taller, spoke up when something was bothering her. Anthony could see the change in her, in the way she no longer folded into herself when Thomas entered the room, in the way she held firm when setting boundaries. Therapy had given her a voice and she was finally using it. To stand up for her son, for herself, and for all the things she had let slip through the cracks before. Thomas? Well, he was still Thomas. But he was less rigid, less caught up in the need to control every situation. He didn't bark orders or impose his authority the way he used to. Instead, he listened. He took his time before speaking, and when he did, there was thoughtfulness behind his words instead of just expectation. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was progress. And Anthony had to admit, that was more than he ever thought possible. And him? He was no longer waiting for them to fail. He didn't sit on edge, expecting old habits to creep back in. He engaged with them freely, not out of duty but because he wanted to. He had let go of the resentment that used to sit heavy in his chest, dragging him down every time he thought about his childhood. Forgiveness hadn't come easy, and it wasn't a singular moment. It was a process. Some days it felt impossible. Other days it felt like second nature. But sitting there, watching his mother smile without hesitation and hearing Thomas speak without the weight of his old arrogance, Anthony realized that he no longer held any animosity. He didn't know what the future held for them, but he believed in the possibility of something better. And that was enough. Graduation day arrived faster than Anthony expected. One moment he was buried in textbooks, cramming for finals, and the next he was standing in his cap and gown, looking out over a sea of faces. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the ceremony, as if the universe itself was acknowledging the magnitude of this day. Yolanda and Anthony stood at the top of the class, a title they had worked tirelessly for, side by side. Ethan wasn't far behind, and though academics had never been his main focus, he had pushed himself, proving that he was more than just an athlete. As Anthony stepped up to the podium, his heartbeat pounded in his ears, but not from nerves. It was excitement. Relief even. He scanned the audience, taking in the sight of everyone who had helped him reach this moment. Lance sat near the front, his expression filled with pride, the kind Anthony had once longed for but never thought he would receive. William and Martha sat beside him, offering their unwavering support, and he knew without a doubt that they saw him as family. Linda was there too, sitting next to Sophie, who bounced excitedly in her seat. She caught Anthony's eye and waved, her smile wide and sincere. Thomas sat beside her, looking more composed than Anthony had ever seen him, as if he finally understood the weight of everything that had led to this moment. And then there was Ethan, grinning like he knew exactly what was going through his brother's head. Yolanda gave Anthony a small nod from her seat, her eyes shining with encouragement. She had always believed in him even when he doubted himself, and knowing she was there, celebrating alongside him, made the moment even sweeter. Anthony took a deep breath and began his speech, speaking not just about academics and success, but about resilience, about the unexpected turns life could take, and about the people who stood beside them through it all. For the first time he wasn't just looking forward. He was looking around, seeing how far he had come. And he was happy. After the ceremony, everyone headed back to the guest house for a celebratory dinner. The air buzzed with excitement, a mix of relief and joy settling in after such a momentous day. As they pulled into the driveway, the warm glow of string lights illuminated the backyard, casting a soft, golden hue over everything. When they stepped inside, the sight took Anthony's breath away. The guest house had been transformed into a place worthy of celebration. The dining area had been set up with long tables draped in elegant linens, adorned with candles and fresh flowers. The mouth-watering aroma of expertly prepared food filled the air, making his stomach rumble in anticipation. Amanda had truly outdone herself. She stood near the kitchen, overseeing the final touches as the staff bustled around, ensuring everything was perfect. Platters of roasted meats, fresh seafood, vibrant salads, and decadent desserts lined the tables, each dish more inviting than the last. "You didn't have to go this far," Anthony told her, a mix of gratitude and astonishment in his voice. Amanda smirked, wiping her hands on her apron. Of course I did. Tonight is a special night. You all deserve to be celebrated properly. Lance walked over, clapping a hand on Anthony's shoulder. She wouldn't take no for an answer, he admitted with a chuckle. Not that any of us are complaining. William and Martha arrived shortly after, greeting everyone warmly as they admired the setup. Ethan whistled low, clearly impressed. Man, this is next level. I was expecting pizza and soda, not a 5-star experience. Yolanda slipped her hand into Anthony's, squeezing gently. You deserve this, Anthony. We all do. He looked around at everyone gathered. His family, the people who had stood by him, who had seen him through his darkest days and still believed in him. Tonight wasn't just about graduation. It was about everything they had endured, everything they had overcome. He exhaled, a deep sense of peace settling in his chest. All right, he said, smiling as he grabbed a plate. Let's eat. The dinner conversation was lively as Yolanda, Ethan, and Anthony shared their plans for the future. I can't believe we're actually done with high school, Ethan said, shaking his head in disbelief. Feels like just yesterday we were complaining about exams and now, well, we're talking about college and careers. Yolanda grinned. And some of us have had our plans set in stone for a while. She nudged Anthony playfully. Mr. Future Business Tycoon over here. He chuckled. Well, it helps to have some guidance. He glanced at William and Lance, both of whom had been instrumental in helping him navigate his ambitions. I'm excited to start working under William this summer, getting a real hands-on experience before college starts. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Man, that's amazing. I'm also looking forward to starting Stanford in the fall. Thomas, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. That's good, Ethan. I'm proud of you. Both of you. His voice sounded full of real pride. Ethan nodded. Thanks, Dad. He turned back to Anthony. But, seriously, dude, you're going to be in the big leagues. You sure you're ready for that? Anthony smirked. After everything we've been through, I think I can handle it. The table burst into laughter, and Anthony felt the warmth of the moment settle in. He raised his glass for a toast. To embracing the future. Everyone chimed in, raising their glasses. To embracing the future. Chapter 13. 5 years had passed, and life had taken turns Anthony never could have predicted. He had graduated from MIT summa cum laude, while Yolanda, as brilliant as ever, earned her mechanical engineering degree magna cum laude. Now they had settled into a sleek penthouse in Silicon Valley, just minutes from Tech Innovation's headquarters, where Anthony continued working under William's mentorship. Yolanda had secured a coveted position with Union Bay Consultants, a top-tier engineering firm, where her innovative designs were already making waves. Ethan had taken a different but equally impressive route. He had graduated from Stanford and now worked at a prestigious law firm in Boston, quickly rising through the ranks in corporate law. Sophie, now 12, had blossomed into a fiercely intelligent and determined young girl who reminded Anthony of himself. She bombarded him with questions about business and technology, eager to learn everything she could. Her enthusiasm was a constant reminder of how far they had all come. As for his parents, their relationship had settled into something steady, something real. The weight of past resentment had lifted, leaving behind a quiet understanding. They would never be the picture-perfect family, but they had found a way to exist together without the shadows of the past dictating their future. Anthony had let go of the anger he once held onto so tightly, and in its place, he had found peace. Yolanda and Anthony had built a life together, one rooted in respect, unwavering support, and a deep love that only grew stronger with time. No matter how demanding their careers became, they always made time for each other. Their evenings were sacred. Whether it was cooking together, taking late-night drives, or unwinding on the balcony while the city hummed below them, they had learned that success meant nothing if they lost sight of what truly mattered. One evening, Anthony planned a special dinner at an upscale restaurant, a place with soft candlelight, elegant decor, and a breathtaking view of the city skyline. He wanted everything to be perfect. Not just the setting but the moment itself. More than anything, he wanted this to be a night Yolanda would remember forever. As they sat across from each other, the conversation flowed effortlessly, laughter filling the air as they reminisced about their journey together. But beneath Anthony's calm exterior, his heart pounded. The small velvet box in his pocket felt heavier with each passing second. After dessert, he took a deep breath, stood up, and reached for her hand. Yolanda, he said, dropping to one knee. From the moment you came into my life, you've been my rock, my greatest supporter, my best friend. I can't imagine a future without you by my side. Will you marry me? Tears welled in her eyes as she covered her mouth, nodding before finally whispering, "Yes." The restaurant erupted in applause, but in that moment, all Anthony could see was her. Her joy, her love, her unwavering faith in them. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, he knew that their journey together was only just beginning. When they returned home, the excitement between them was still electric. Yolanda couldn't stop staring at her ring, her smile never leaving her face. The moment they stepped through the door, they wasted no time. They called everyone to share the news. William and Martha had their suspicions but still cheered as if they were genuinely surprised. Martha immediately dove into wedding ideas, while William simply smirked and said, "About time." Ethan, as expected, was loud and dramatic. "Finally. I was starting to think you were waiting for permission," he teased. "I better be the best man." Sophie's reaction was by far the sweetest. "Does this mean I get to be a junior bridesmaid?" she asked excitedly. "I know I'm too old to be a flower girl." When they called Anthony's parents, the response was more subdued but still heartfelt. Linda teared up, offering warm congratulations, while Thomas, though never overly sentimental, simply said, "I'm happy for you, son." It was simple, but it meant something. Lance's excitement was unmistakable. "I knew this day would come," he said, his voice full of warmth. "You've always been determined in everything you do, and I had no doubt that applied to love too." His words carried weight, and for a moment, Anthony let himself appreciate how much had changed between them. From a distant figure in the shadows to an undeniable presence in his life, Lance had become more than just the father he never knew. He had become family. "I better be at the wedding," Lance added, his tone light but serious enough to make it clear he wouldn't take no for an answer. "You will be," Anthony assured him. "Front and center." Lance let out a satisfied sigh. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." As the excitement settled, reality began to sink in. They were engaged. They were truly building a future together. As Yolanda leaned into his side, her fingers laced with his, Anthony knew without a doubt. They were ready for whatever came next. 3 weeks passed and the wedding preparations were in full swing. Linda and Martha flew in to help, and it was surreal watching his mother so involved in his life in a way she had never been before. She and Martha threw themselves into planning, discussing floral arrangements, venues, and guest lists as if they had been waiting for this moment their entire lives. Martha, ever the efficient planner, had already compiled a list of top-tier vendors, while Linda surprised Anthony with how much she genuinely enjoyed the process. "I never got to help plan a wedding before," she admitted one evening, flipping through a bridal magazine. "I want to make this special for you both." Yolanda and Anthony exchanged a look, and he saw the warmth in her eyes. She squeezed his hand, silently letting him know she saw the effort his mother was making. As for Anthony, he was just grateful. Grateful that, for once, planning something big in his life wasn't overshadowed by the past. Instead, it was filled with laughter, excitement, and the promise of a future he had built for himself. He stepped away to his home office to give the women their space. Lance, William, Thomas, and Ethan would be arriving that weekend to help with his side of the planning. As he settled into his chair, he let himself soak in the calm. A calm that had been years in the making. For the first time in his life, Anthony wasn't just surviving. He was truly living. Epilogue. 10 years had passed since Yolanda and Anthony exchanged their vows, and life had flourished in ways they once only dreamed of. Anthony had risen to the helm of tech innovations as CEO after Lance stepped down, though his father remained chairman of the board, always offering wisdom and guidance. Yolanda had built an extraordinary career of her own, heading research and development at one of the most innovative engineering firms in the country. Yet, through all their accomplishments, they remained true to the promise they made on their wedding day. To never let their careers overshadow what truly mattered, their family. The most fulfilling part of this journey had come in the form of two incredible additions to their world. Their 6-year-old twins, John and Margaret, named after Yolanda's late parents. They were the light of their lives, filled with boundless curiosity and energy. Watching them grow, seeing them discover the world with wide-eyed wonder, gave Anthony a deeper sense of purpose than any title or achievement ever could. Parenthood had been a challenge, but it had been the greatest, most rewarding adventure of all. Ethan, ever the protective older brother, had married just a year after Anthony and Yolanda. Now living in Boston with his wife and daughter, he had made a name for himself at a prestigious law firm, quickly rising to become one of its most sought-after corporate attorneys. Despite the distance, the bond between the brothers remained strong. Ethan made it a point to fly back to California whenever possible, ensuring that no amount of success could take precedence over family. Sophie, now 22, had grown into a fiercely ambitious and intelligent young woman. She had recently joined Tech Innovations, and while she carried Anthony's mentorship, she was carving out her own name in the industry. She had proven herself more than capable, driven by the same relentless determination that had fueled Anthony's rise. Seeing her chase her dreams, knowing he had played a small role in encouraging her, filled him with immense pride. As for Thomas and Linda, time had softened what once felt like irreparable wounds. They had settled into a life of balance, splitting their time between two homes. One in Boston, close to Ethan, and another in California, where they could be near Anthony and the twins. The years had changed them. Thomas, once distant and hardened by pride, had softened in his later years. Becoming a grandfather had reshaped his perspective in ways no one could have predicted. He was present, engaged, and while the past would never fully be erased, Anthony saw genuine love in the way his stepfather interacted with John and Margaret. Linda, too, had transformed. She had found her voice and confidence, standing firm in ways she never did before. Their relationship had taken years to rebuild, but it no longer carried hesitation or guilt. Only love. The years had reshaped them all, proving that healing was not only possible but necessary. The past no longer defined them, and in its place was something Anthony never thought he would have. A family that chose to stay together, not out of obligation but out of love. William and Martha remained the ever-doting grandparents. Perhaps even more so than anyone else. William, despite his demanding schedule, never missed a chance to spoil the twins, bringing them the latest tech gadgets or introducing them to the wonders of engineering. Martha, ever the balancing force, ensured that while they were indulged they also stayed grounded. Their home had become a second haven for the twins, who adored spending weekends with their grandparents, soaking in stories of adventure and wisdom from Martha and learning the art of innovation from William. Watching them with his children reminded Anthony of the role they had played in his life. How they had stepped in when he needed guidance the most. They were his support, his family, long before he had the courage to claim them as such. Now, they extended that same love and wisdom to the next generation, and he would never take that for granted. And then there was Lance. A man who had once existed only as a distant, painful question mark in Anthony's life now stood as one of his strongest pillars. He had made it his priority to be present for John and Margaret, never missing a milestone no matter how small. Whether it was school recitals, birthdays, or a simple weekend at the park, he was always there making memories with them. Anthony saw it in his father's eyes. How much it meant to him to be a part of their lives in a way he couldn't be for his own. And strangely, Anthony did not resent it. If anything, it reassured him. It showed him just how much Lance truly cared, how deeply he regretted the time they had lost. Lance could never change the past, but he was doing everything in his power to make the present and the future different. And through it all, Anthony had realized something profound. Love isn't just about presence, it's about effort. And Lance had proven time and time again that he would never stop trying. The year the twins turned 7, Anthony and Yolanda planned a grand family gathering. One that would bring everyone together. Thomas, Linda, Ethan and his family, Sophie, William, Martha, and of course Lance. It had been a long time since they had all been in the same place together, and this time, there was no tension, no lingering shadows of the past. Only family coming together to celebrate. Lance arrived early, carrying beautifully wrapped gifts for John and Margaret. Anthony caught the way his father's eyes softened as the twins ran up to embrace him, their laughter filling the air. It was a stark contrast to the man who had once watched him from afar, too afraid to step into his life. Now he was fully present, an irreplaceable part of their world. As they sat around the large dining table, reminiscing and sharing stories, Anthony took a moment to take it all in. His mother and Thomas, once distant, now fully engaged in their roles as grandparents. Ethan and him, laughing like they did as kids, bound by a brotherhood that time had never wavered. Sophie, confident and thriving in the world she was building for herself. William and Martha, the ever-present anchors in his life. And Lance, who had become the father Anthony never thought he'd have. When it came time to cut the twins' birthday cake, Anthony looked around at the people who had shaped his journey. Some through love, some through hardship, but all of them had played a role in bringing him to this moment. For the first time he felt no bitterness, no regret. Only gratitude. He had spent so much of his life fighting for his place, struggling to prove that he was more than second best. But sitting here, surrounded by the people he loved, Anthony realized something important. He never had to prove anything. He was always enough. And now he was finally home.
Thank you all for listening. If this story piques your interest and you want to know what happens next, feel free to like and subscribe. Turn on the notification button to be alerted when the next chapter has been posted. Also, leave a comment. I look forward to reading your thoughts, and I will do my best to respond. I'm always open for constructive feedback. Thanks in advance.